This is Focal Point with Brian Fisher on AFR Talk. Listen to the audio podcast or download today's program at afr.net. You can also read Brian Fisher's columns at onenewsnow.com. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us anytime at focalpoint@afr.net. Focalpoint@afr.net.
Welcome back to this Thursday edition of Focal Point on AFR Talk. And I want to kind of move forward in this segment with asking you to respond to this question that Eric Erickson raises, staunch conservative guy on Red State. He says this, talking about what the GOP establishment has done in Mississippi. They have tarred a conservative candidate in their own party as a racist. They have tarred his supporters as racists. They have accused his supporters of virtually belonging to the Ku Klux Klan. They provided money, walking around money, to give to Democratic operatives to hand out to black pastors to turn out liberal Democratic votes for Thad Cochran to cross over and vote in the Republican runoff. And they succeeded. They won the election. Cochran was the winner. And so here is his question. Should the Republican establishment in Washington get away with comparing its own base to Klansmen? Should the Republican establishment in Washington get away with tarring its own voters as racists? If there is no consequence, they will just simply keep on doing it. He says there must be some consequence. He answers his own question. There must be some consequence. I am just not sure what it should be. But it's got to be something other than allowing the base to be treated as the battered wife of the establishment. So, number to call is 888-589-8840. Keep it civil. Keep it courteous. You can be direct. You can be blunt. But let's keep it under control here. But what do you think the consequence ought to be for the GOP establishment for the way they have treated Chris McDaniel and the way they have treated their own base? 888-589-8840. What should the pushback be? What can we do? What do you think that can be done? If you're a part of the Republican Party and you don't like what's happened, what do you think ought to be done? Now, here is a piece from a website called 538.com run by Nate Silver. Now, this piece is actually written by a guy by the name of Harry Enton, took over this website from Nate Silver. But Nate Silver made his bones running this website as an electoral prognosticator and analyst. This guy is the best in the business. He called the 2012 presidential election better than anybody else. Everybody was wowed by how accurate his predictions were. So he's widely considered to be an absolute guru when it comes to electoral analysis. Now, here is his breakdown from the election on Tuesday. About 375,000 voters showed up Tuesday compared to 319,000 on June 3. That's an increase of more than 17%. This is unheard of, where you have more in a runoff than you do in a primary. So that raises questions all by itself. Cochran raised his vote total by more than 38,000 votes, while McDaniel pulled in only an additional 30,000. That was more than enough to erase McDaniel's 1,400 vote lead in the first round. So you got the 17% increase in turnout from the primary to the runoff. Thad Cochran increased his vote total by 38,000 between the primary and the runoff. Chris McDaniel reeled in an extra 30,000 votes, but that pales in comparison to Cochran's 38,000. So the question is, where did these 38,000 Cochran votes come from? And he answers his own question. It is clear that Cochran's vote increases were correlated to the percentage of African Americans who live in each county. The 10 counties where the incumbent senator improved most were those where blacks make up 69% or more of the population. Take Hinds County, where African Americans make up 69% of the population as an example. Cochran increased his vote total there by about 7,000 votes from the first round in the primary. That's in one county. That one county explains the differential right there. Senator Cochran won the runoff because of Hinds County. Increased his vote total there, 7,000 votes from the primary. If 30% of Cochran's vote increase can be explained by the racial makeup of the county, less than 1% of McDaniel's vote increase can. So in other words, there was a huge minority turnout for Thad Cochran. 30% of his vote increase is explained purely by the racial makeup of the counties that voted for him. Then he says, look, we can also see what would have happened had there been no increase in the number of African Americans or Democratic voters in the runoff. So Harry Enton, 538, says, look, we can take a look. We can do some kind of regressions here. We can compare vote totals in June 3rd in the primary to vote totals in the runoff. And we can draw some conclusions about what the results of this election would have been if African American voters, Democrats, hadn't showed up, if liberal Democrats hadn't showed up to vote for Cochran. So I won't bore you with the details and his analysis here. He's got charts and maps and stuff. But here is his bottom line analysis. The result, if you leach out the African American vote, if you leach out the Democratic vote, in other words, if you take away all of the liberal Democrats that voted on June 24 who did not vote on June 3. So these are Democrats that didn't vote on June 3. If they voted on June 3 in the Democratic primary, they couldn't vote on June 24. We don't know how many of them managed to slip through the net. I think McDaniel's campaign is looking into that right now because that would be an outright voter fraud, whether it was intentional or unintentional. That would be a problem. That could be identified. That could be traced. I mean, you could possibly do something about that. But my suspicion is probably not enough slip through the grid to make up a difference. But anyway, it's something that's worth looking at. I think the McDaniel campaign is doing that. But you can get a calculation if you pull all of those liberal Democrat votes out, how would the results have been different? And here's what he says. Instead of Cochran winning the runoff by 2 points or about 6,000 votes, he loses by a little less than 8 points or about 25,000 votes. He drops about 40,000 votes from his 190,000 vote total, whereas McDaniel would lose only about 15,000 from his 185,000 vote total. So in other words, there were 40,000 votes for for Cochran that came out of this push to get liberal Democrats to the polls. And remember, the polling data before the election had McDaniel up by about 8 points. And so the question is, how did they get this thing so wrong? The polling data has McDaniel up by 8 points. He winds up losing by 2. That's a 10-point swing. How could these polls be so wrong? And, Harry Enton says that's easy. They weren't factoring in this ruling class Republican voter surge among Democrats. They didn't anticipate that. They didn't count on it. They didn't factor it in. So again, here's the important thing to understand. This is why a lot of conservative Republicans in Mississippi are hacked off, is their guy would have won by 8 points. Their guy would have won by 8 points if the leaders of their own party had not sabotaged them. And so you can understand why they are pretty ticked off. Now, we talked about this open primary thing earlier in this week. I won't reiterate that other than to say, look, this is lunacy. Open primary, which is what you have in Mississippi. It allows the other team to choose your starting lineup. It makes no sense to me, but it does to ruling class Republicans. They like open primaries because they can use it like they did on Tuesday to sabotage and kneecap a conservative. So they like open primaries because they know if Democrats are going to come over to vote, they're going to vote for the most liberal of the two guys that are on the ballot. They're not going to show up and vote for a constitutional conservative. They're going to vote for the guy that most resembles the Democrat. And in their judgment, Cochran was so similar to Travis Childers, virtually no difference in a lot of ways, that they felt perfectly comfortable in casting their vote for the more liberal or the more moderate, if you want to put it that way, of the two Republican candidates. So here is the question: what kind of pushback, what kind of reaction should there be if the Republican Party establishment's not allowed to get away with it? What do you do? Well, there are several options here that you can think of, and I'm going to let you kind of help me sort through what you think the best option would be. Now, one option for conservatives in Mississippi, and this makes perfectly good sense to me. I'm not, and a lot of Republicans are going to do this, and I think this shows some wisdom, and I have no problem with somebody who chooses to go this route. They say, look, I don't like Cochran as the candidate. I prefer the other guy, but I don't want to see Harry Reid get any more power. I don't want to make it easier for Barack Obama to get his nominees past the Senate. So I'm going to vote for the Republican simply out of a desire to sort of exercise some kind of restraint on an out-of-control president. Now, this is typically what Republicans have done for decades and decades and decades. But I understand the thinking, and I think a lot of Republicans in Mississippi are going to do that. Now, a second thing that they could do would be simply to stay home. I'm not going to vote for Senator Cochran. Senator Cochran is part of the reason we're $17.5 trillion in debt. He's been part of the problem. He has not been part of the solution. We need a change. Senator Cochran doesn't represent change. It's more of the same. I can't vote for another ruling class Republican again. I can't vote for another establishment Republican again. We've got to make change. So I'm just going to stay home. And remember, 4 million conservatives stayed home in 2012 because Mitt Romney just did not light a fire under them whatsoever. Now, the third option would be for conservatives to go to the polls and vote for Chris McDaniel again. Now, they've already voted for him twice. They voted for him in the primary. They voted for him in the runoff. The runoff, their guy won the Republican primary. Chris McDaniel won the Republican runoff. Thad Cochran won the Democrat runoff. And so they can say, look, I'm going to vote for the guy that I think by rights should have been the winner in the runoff. My conscience will be absolutely clear in doing it. He's the guy that represents my values. I think he was basically gypped out of an electoral victory that properly belonged to him. I want to cast my vote for somebody who is going to represent my values. And, you know, every ballot's got a write-in line. Every ballot. You can write in anybody. You can write in Humpty Dumpty if you want. And I think there are going to be a lot of grassroots conservatives that say, I'm going to vote for Chris McDaniel the third time. I'm tired of the GOP disenfranchising me, making my vote null and void. I'm going to vote for him a third time and walk out of there with a clear conscience, believing I voted for the guy that represents my values. 888-589-8840. What do you think?